When Dominic the King, O'Reilly, and Arben Hoxha stepped into Liverpool, two worlds collided, one ruled by generations of crime families, the other by a ruthless Albanian Mafia. What followed was a war that would leave the city bleeding and change its underworld forever. Liverpool had always been a city of contrasts, a place where history and modernity collided, where the sound of church bells mingled with the distant roar of the Mersey. To the casual observer, it was a city full of life, music, and culture. The streets bustled with tourists taking photos of iconic landmarks, while locals went about their daily routines, unaware of the invisible network of crime operating beneath their feet. For decades, Liverpool had been controlled by tightly knit crime families who maintained a delicate balance of power. These families had deep roots in the city. Some traced their influence back generations. They ran gambling dens in back alleys, controlled local drug distribution networks, and operated protection rackets that kept many businesses in fear, yet surprisingly loyal. Each family knew its territory and rarely overstepped boundaries, maintaining an uneasy but stable order. But that stability was deceptive. Behind closed doors, rivalries simmered, alliances shifted, and tensions built quietly like a storm brewing on the horizon. The city's criminal ecosystem was complex. Corruption was woven into its core. A local council member turned a blind eye to illegal operations. Certain police officers were quietly on the payroll, and influential businessmen found ways to profit from underground dealings. Most people only saw the surface, completely unaware of the intricate power struggles taking place in shadowed corners of Liverpool. Into this controlled chaos, a new and unexpected player emerged. The Albanian Mafia arrived without fanfare, slipping into the city like ghosts. They were not brash or loud. They did not seek attention through violence at first. Instead, they worked meticulously, studying the landscape, identifying weak points, and quietly embedding themselves in the city's underworld. Unlike local gangs, who relied on established networks and personal loyalty, the Albanians operated with a ruthless efficiency that unnerved those who had long considered themselves untouchable. Their presence was first noticed in subtle ways. Shipments arriving at unusual hours, the appearance of new, untraceable vehicles in certain neighborhoods, and unexplained changes in local business ownership. For the Liverpool families, this was initially just a curiosity, a potential threat that seemed manageable. They underestimated the Albanians, dismissing them as outsiders who wouldn't last long in a city that had long been a fortress of local control. That miscalculation would soon prove catastrophic. The Albanians had no intention of integrating or negotiating. They were here to take over, and their strategy was patient, calculated, and deadly. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens carried on with their lives, unaware that the calm they felt walking along the waterfront or through the city center was temporary. Beneath their feet, alliances were forming and rivalries sharpening. Power was shifting silently, and soon, the delicate balance that had kept Liverpool's underworld in order would be shattered. The city that had thrived for centuries on a combination of culture, trade, and resilience was about to be plunged into chaos. When the storm finally hit, it would bring with it violence, betrayal, and bloodshed unlike anything Liverpool had ever seen. The calm before the storm was not peaceful, it was deceptive. It masked a tension that had been building for months, a silent warning that the rules of the city were about to change forever. Liverpool, with all its history and pride, was about to face a challenge that would test its underworld, its authorities, and its citizens. And when the first signs of war appeared, no one would be able to ignore the power and ruthlessness of the new players in the city. The arrival of the Albanian Mafia in Liverpool was like a shadow stretching across the city, slow, deliberate, and almost invisible at first. They did not make a grand entrance or announce their presence with violence. Instead, they moved quietly, inserting themselves into the existing criminal ecosystem with precision. Unlike the local families, whose operations were often visible and sometimes brazen, the Albanians preferred subtlety. They studied the habits of the Liverpool gangs, learning the routines, weaknesses, and ambitions of each leader. Their intelligence network was meticulous. Every decision seemed calculated to maximize gain and minimize risk. At first, their actions were small but deliberate. They purchased seemingly legitimate businesses, warehouses, shipping companies, and logistics firms. These were not just investments, they were strategic footholds that allowed them to control key supply routes for drugs and weapons. While the local gangs focused on street-level dominance, the Albanians were already controlling the flow of goods into the city. They established safe houses in quiet neighborhoods, often in plain sight, blending seamlessly with the community. The Albanians' methodical approach created an invisible web of influence that would later suffocate the local crime families' operations. Liverpool's established crime families initially viewed the newcomers with skepticism rather than fear. Outsiders, after all, had tried to encroach on the city before, and most had failed. Local leaders assumed that the Albanians, being foreign and unfamiliar with Liverpool's unique networks, would be easy to outmaneuver. But this assumption was a fatal mistake. The Albanians were not here to compete. They were here to dominate. They built alliances with minor gangs and disillusioned members of larger families, offering incentives that were difficult to refuse. Slowly, they created divisions within Liverpool's criminal hierarchy, turning trust into suspicion and loyalty into doubt. By the time the local families realized the extent of the threat, the Albanians had already secured crucial control over key docks and warehouses. Their influence extended to both the visible and invisible parts of the city: street-level operations, high-level distribution, and even certain elements within law enforcement. They understood the importance of intelligence and foresight, ensuring that any retaliation from local gangs could be anticipated and countered. While Liverpool's crime families were accustomed to brute force, the Albanians relied on strategy and foresight, turning the city into a chessboard where every move was calculated and every weakness exploited. As the Albanians grew bolder, small clashes began to occur. A disputed shipment here, a sabotage deal there, minor incidents at first, easily dismissed as random or coincidental. But each event was a test, a probe to assess the reactions of Liverpool's gangs. The Albanians measured every response, learning which leaders were cautious, which were reckless, and which could be manipulated. By doing this, they systematically destabilized the city's underworld without firing a single shot. The local crime families, unprepared for a foe that combined patience, ruthlessness, and strategic intelligence, started feeling the pressure. Fear replaced confidence, suspicion replaced trust, and the once predictable streets of Liverpool became a battlefield in the making. The Albanians' presence was no longer subtle. It was a looming threat that promised chaos. The quiet infiltration had transformed into a slow but unstoppable assertion of power, setting the stage for a violent confrontation that no one could have fully anticipated. Liverpool was about to learn that the calm deception of these newcomers was more dangerous than any immediate outbreak of violence. A storm was coming, and the city's underworld was on the brink of being rewritten entirely. The first signs of open conflict erupted at the Liverpool docks, a place that had long been the lifeblood of the city's trade and, unknowingly, its criminal enterprises. Normally, a scene of routine activity: workers loading shipments, cranes moving containers, trucks arriving and departing, the docks became a theater of violence that would shock the city. What began as a single intercepted shipment quickly escalated into a confrontation that no one could ignore. Liverpool's crime families had grown accustomed to controlling these zones, safeguarding their shipments and maintaining dominance over incoming and outgoing goods. The sudden interference by the Albanian Mafia was a bold and calculated move, signaling that the outsiders were no longer content to remain invisible. The raid itself was chaotic and brutal. Masked figures struck with precision, targeting warehouses known to hold drugs and weapons. Security cameras recorded blurry images of armed men moving swiftly through the docks, leaving destruction in their wake. Storage units were set ablaze, shipments destroyed, and the faint smell of smoke and gunpowder lingered over the city. Bodies were found in abandoned alleyways nearby, showing the ruthless efficiency of the attackers. It was clear to everyone that this was not random street violence. It was an organized assault designed to send a message. Liverpool's underworld had been breached in the most public and humiliating way. The Liverpool families responded quickly, but their retaliation lacked the precision and coordination of the Albanians. Frantic attempts to track down the perpetrators led to further confusion. In the chaos, old rivalries resurfaced as members accused each other of negligence or betrayal. The Albanians had anticipated this, carefully engineering the timing of their strike to create maximum disruption. Within days, the docks, once a symbol of steady criminal control, became a contested battlefield. Workers and residents alike were caught in the crossfire, witnessing a level of violence that many had previously only heard about in rumors. What made this attack particularly shocking was its sophistication. The Albanians did not rely solely on brute force. They used intelligence and timing. Every warehouse they targeted was chosen for strategic importance. Every shipment they intercepted had maximum impact. The message was clear. The Albanians were not here to negotiate or coexist. They were here to dominate, and anyone who stood in their way would face deadly consequences. Liverpool's crime families, for the first time, understood the scale of the threat. The quiet infiltration had turned into an aggressive campaign, and the city's underworld was unprepared for such a formidable opponent. The violence at the docks sent shockwaves far beyond the immediate area. News of the attack spread quickly, creating fear and uncertainty across the city. Ordinary citizens became wary, noticing unfamiliar faces in their neighborhoods, hearing the distant sound of gunfire late at night, and seeing the sudden appearance of abandoned vehicles and burned-out warehouses. For the first time, Liverpool's gang war was no longer contained to the shadows. It had spilled into public consciousness, leaving everyone to realize that safety was an illusion. As the dust settled, the Albanians had not only demonstrated their power, but had also shifted the psychological balance of the city. Fear replaced confidence among local criminals, while the general public began to feel the weight of an invisible war that was now unmistakably real. The docks had been transformed from a symbol of control into a warning. The bloodiest gang war in Britain was no longer looming. It had begun. Liverpool would never be the same again. As the violence at the docks subsided, the underworld of Liverpool began to shift in ways that were as invisible as they were dangerous. Both sides recognized that brute force alone would not secure victory. Strategy and alliances had become the true weapons of war. The local crime families, once fragmented by internal rivalries, started tentatively reaching out to one another, forming temporary pacts against the Albanian threat. These alliances were fragile, built more on fear than trust. Long-standing grudges were set aside, but old wounds never fully healed, leaving every handshake tinged with suspicion. Meanwhile, the Albanian Mafia moved with calculated precision, exploiting the cracks within Liverpool's criminal hierarchy. They courted minor gangs and disenfranchised members of the larger families, offering protection, financial incentives, and promises of power in exchange for loyalty. These deals were rarely straightforward. Every new recruit had to prove themselves, and betrayal was met with swift and lethal consequences. Slowly, the Albanians created a web of influence that spread through the city, touching corners of Liverpool that had never before felt the reach of foreign power. Their strategy was simple but effective: destabilize from within while consolidating strength externally. The war increasingly became a battle of intelligence as much as firepower. Each side relied on spies, informants, and bribed officials to gain the upper hand. The Liverpool families attempted to predict Albanian movements, but the newcomers were unpredictable, adapting quickly to each countermeasure. The Albanians' ability to anticipate responses and manipulate the loyalties of others gave them a distinct advantage. Every betrayal, every sudden shift in allegiance, further destabilized the local gangs, leaving them vulnerable to both strategic attacks and opportunistic violence. As the web of alliances expanded, the city itself became a maze of hidden loyalties and secret dealings. Safe houses were reinforced, meetings were held in abandoned warehouses or remote locations, and the boundaries between friend and foe blurred. Even seasoned members of the Liverpool families struggled to identify who could be trusted. Public spaces became arenas of uncertainty. A familiar face might be a spy, a casual neighbor might report activity to the Albanians, and every routine move carried the risk of exposure. Fear and paranoia began to dominate decision-making, as suspicion crept into the minds of even the most experienced criminals. The consequences of these fragile alliances were deadly and immediate. Informants were discovered and eliminated in gruesome fashion, while those who dared to switch loyalties often met violent ends. The Albanians were ruthless in their enforcement, using violence as both punishment and warning. Meanwhile, the temporary alliances among Liverpool's families were constantly tested by ambition and mistrust. Deals fell apart, leaders questioned each other's intentions, and retaliatory attacks often struck those who had been considered allies just days earlier. In this environment, loyalty became a rare commodity, and betrayal became the most dangerous game in the city. By the end of this period, the war had evolved into a complex network of shifting power, fear, and manipulation. Both sides had strengthened their positions, but at an enormous cost. Streets that had once been predictable were now battlegrounds. Neighborhoods that had once been neutral were drawn into the conflict, and every resident of Liverpool, knowingly or not, was caught in the tension. The alliances, betrayals, and secret maneuvers had set the stage for the next phase of the War I, where violence would escalate beyond anything the city had experienced before, leaving a trail of blood and devastation in its wake. The gang war that had simmered in shadowed corners of Liverpool began spilling into the public eye, transforming the city streets into arenas of fear and chaos. What had once been a largely hidden conflict now erupted in broad daylight, shattering the sense of safety residents had long taken for granted. Drive-by shootings became alarmingly common, occurring not in deserted alleys, but on busy streets lined with homes and shops. Bullets tore through windows, leaving glass shattered on pavements, and children's toys scattered amidst the chaos. The violence no longer respected the traditional boundaries of gang territory. Any neighborhood could become a battlefield without warning. Arson became another weapon of intimidation. Businesses suspected of collaborating with rival factions were set ablaze, often in the dead of night. Flames consumed warehouses, pubs, and even private homes, leaving thick smoke drifting over streets once known for their vibrant character. Firefighters responded frantically, but the damage was already done, both in property and in the psychological terror inflicted on residents. The Albanians, in particular, demonstrated an uncanny ability to strike with precision, targeting locations that would send a message not only to rival gangs, but to anyone thinking of opposing them. Kidnappings and disappearances added a chilling layer to the violence. High-ranking members of Liverpool's crime families, and sometimes even minor associates, vanished without a trace. Rumors spread of bodies hidden in abandoned buildings, canals, or even buried beneath the docks. Fear of being the next target permeated every level of the criminal network. Even those with no direct involvement in the war felt its presence, as families locked doors, children stayed indoors, and the city itself seemed to shrink under the weight of unseen terror. Media coverage amplified the fear. News outlets reported on shootings, arson attacks, and police raids almost daily. Headlines painted a picture of a city under siege, a Liverpool unrecognizable from the tourist-friendly image projected to the world. Residents who once walked the streets with ease began avoiding even familiar routes, while businesses suffered as customers stayed away. The war was no longer confined to the underworld. It had seeped into every corner of life, altering routines and casting a shadow over the city's identity. Amid this chaos, the Albania's strategic advantage became increasingly evident. Unlike the local families, who often reacted impulsively or out of angerzeth, Albanian Mafia calculated each attack, considering not just immediate impact, but long-term consequences. They understood the value of terror, using it to destabilize opponents psychologically as much as physically. Liverpool's crime families, on the other hand, struggled to adapt. Internal distrust and miscommunication hampered their ability to respond effectively, making them increasingly vulnerable to ambushes and infiltration. Even law enforcement faced unprecedented challenges. Corruption and fear had long complicated efforts to contain organized crime, but the public nature of the violence forced police to act. Yet the Albania's careful planning often allowed them to stay one step ahead, evading arrests and leaving minimal evidence. Every raid, every investigation, seemed to reveal just how deeply the Mafia had embedded itself in the city's fabric. By the time the dust settled after a particularly violent week, Liverpool was transformed. Streets were scarred with bullet holes, burnt-out vehicles littered the corners, and residents carried the invisible burden of fear. The gang war had proven that no part of the city was truly safe, and that ordinary life could be shattered in a matter of hours. The public nature of the violence had changed the stakes for everyone involved: residents, criminals, and authorities alike, and set the stage for a turning point that would determine the fate of Liverpool's underworld. War in Liverpool had reached a fever pitch, but the balance of power remained precarious, with neither side fully dominant. The streets were scarred from months of relentless violence, and both the local crime families and the Albanian Mafia had suffered losses that would haunt them forever. Yet the Albanians, with their meticulous planning and network of influence, had maintained an edge. The turning point came not from a battle fought in the streets, but from an act of betrayal that would shake Liverpool's underworld to its core. One of the most trusted lieutenants of the Liverpool crime families, a man known for his loyalty and strategic mind, made a decision that no one anticipated. The reasons behind his betrayal were complex, a mix of fear, ambition, and the realization that the Albania's power could not be ignored. He began feeding critical intelligence to the Albanians: supply schedules, safe house locations, secret meeting points, and the identities of key enforcers. This single act of treachery dismantled months of careful planning by the Liverpool families. Operations that had once seemed secure were suddenly exposed, leaving the families vulnerable to strikes they could not anticipate. The Albanians wasted no time exploiting this advantage. Coordinated attacks hit multiple locations simultaneously, targeting not only shipments, but key figures within the Liverpool networks. Safe houses were raided, vehicles were destroyed, and rival enforcers were eliminated with chilling precision. The element of surprise, combined with insider information, turned the tide decisively. Families that had once operated with confidence found themselves constantly on the defensive, scrambling to protect their operations and personnel. Panic replaced strategy, and suspicion began to erode the remaining cohesion of the local gangs. Law enforcement, long hampered by corruption and fear, finally gained momentum from the chaos. Investigators, emboldened by the visible escalation, began conducting raids, wiretaps, and undercover operations. Yet even as arrests were made, the Albanians seemed to anticipate every move, leaving minimal evidence and often relocating personnel and assets before authorities could intervene. Their calculated foresight and disciplined operations contrasted sharply with the reactive, chaotic measures of the Liverpool families. The betrayal also had profound psychological effects. Trust, which had always been fragile in the criminal world, became nearly non-existent. Even the most loyal members of the Liverpool families began questioning the intentions of their comrades. Paranoia spread like wildfire. Meetings were held in smaller, more secretive groups, and every action was scrutinized for hidden motives. Fear and uncertainty became as powerful a weapon as any firearm, as the families realized that even internal alliances could not be trusted. By the end of this period, The balance of power had shifted dramatically. The Albanians, once outsiders, now controlled the majority of the city's critical criminal operations. The Liverpool crime families were weakened, fractured, and vulnerable. The streets, once a chaotic but predictable battleground, were now a carefully monitored chessboard under Albanian control. The betrayal had not only changed tactical positions, but had altered the very psychology of Liverpool's criminal landscape. The city, already traumatized by months of violence, now faced a new reality. The Albanians had demonstrated that strategic planning and ruthless intelligence could overcome long-standing local dominance. The betrayal had reshaped the war entirely, setting the stage for a final confrontation that would leave scars far deeper than those seen on the streets. Liverpool's underworld would never recover its old order, and the consequences of this turning point would reverberate for years to come. The final showdown of Liverpool's bloodiest gang war unfolded on the outskirts of the city, far from the crowded streets and bustling docks that had once witnessed the early signs of violence. A secluded warehouse, abandoned and isolated, became the stage for a confrontation that had been building for months. Both sides arrived prepared, armed, and aware that this battle could determine the future of Liverpool's criminal underworld. The tension was palpable, a quiet before the inevitable storm, as each faction took its positions and waited for the signal to strike. The battle began with sudden ferocity. Gunfire echoed through the empty lot surrounding the warehouse, shattering windows and sending sparks of debris into the air. Explosives detonated inside, collapsing walls and leaving plumes of smoke that hung ominously over the city. The Albanians, disciplined and precise, executed a coordinated assault, moving in calculated teams that systematically neutralized key members of the Liverpool families. Their strategy relied on speed, intelligence, and ruthless efficiency, leaving little room for error. The Liverpool gangs, though desperate and determined, struggled to respond effectively under the relentless assault in the chaos. The violence became indiscriminate. Senior lieutenants were taken down alongside foot soldiers, while even non-combatants caught in the warehouse were not spared. The Albanians' aim was clear: eliminate opposition decisively and send an unambiguous message about who now controlled the city. Fires raged inside the building, and the smell of smoke, gunpowder, and blood mixed into a suffocating haze. Each explosion and gunshot was a reminder of the war's high stakes, where one mistake could mean death, and every decision carried irreversible consequences. Outside the warehouse, law enforcement arrived, responding to reports of the massive gunfight. By the time they reached the scene, much of the battle had already concluded, leaving behind chaos and devastation. Burned vehicles, bullet-riddled walls, and scattered debris marked the aftermath. The Albanians had executed a clean withdrawal, leaving only enough evidence to confirm the scale of their victory, but not enough for authorities to dismantle their operation entirely. In contrast, the Liverpool crime families had suffered catastrophic losses, with many leaders killed, captured, or forced into hiding. The balance of power had shifted irreversibly. The psychological impact of the showdown extended far beyond the immediate violence. Survivors on both sides were left traumatized, haunted by the sheer brutality of the confrontation. The Liverpool families, once dominant, were now fractured and demoralized, their ability to regroup severely compromised. Even allies who had supported them throughout the conflict began reconsidering loyalties, fearing retribution or elimination by the victorious Albanians. The city itself bore the scars, physical, psychological, and social, from the most violent chapter in its criminal history. The Albanians emerged from the battle not only as victors, but as the unchallenged rulers of Liverpool's underworld. Their dominance was solidified through a combination of strategy, intelligence, and uncompromising violence. Yet even in victory, the city remained a tense and dangerous place. Rumors of revenge, lingering grudges, and unresolved conflicts ensured that peace was tenuous at best. The final showdown had not just ended a war. It had rewritten the rules of criminal control in Liverpool. Streets that were once territories of local families were now under the watchful eyes of a foreign power, and the city's underworld would never return to its previous order. In the aftermath of the final showdown, Liverpool was left scarred and forever changed. The Albanian Mafia had solidified its grip on the city's criminal underworld, leaving the once powerful local families weakened, scattered, or completely eliminated. The streets, still bearing the marks of countless shootings, burned out vehicles, and destroyed properties, served as a constant reminder of the war that had engulfed the city. Even months after the violence had ended, residents walked with caution, their lives shaped by fear and uncertainty. The war had not only altered the criminal landscape, but had infiltrated the daily routines of ordinary citizens, leaving a lasting imprint on Liverpool's identity. The Albanian Mafia moved quickly to consolidate power. Safe houses, warehouses, and previously contested territories were claimed and fortified. Smaller gangs and independent operators, realizing the futility of resistance, either pledged allegiance or disappeared from the city's criminal scene entirely. Their presence was no longer hidden or subtle. The Albanians openly controlled key drug routes, distribution networks, and protection rackets. Their methodical approach ensured that, unlike the chaotic rise of local crime families, their dominance would remain structured and sustainable. Every corner of Liverpool's underworld was now linked to their influence, and even law enforcement struggled to adapt to the new reality. For the local families, the aftermath was devastating. Many leaders went into hiding, forced to abandon their long-held territories. Others were captured, imprisoned, or eliminated in the chaotic final days of the war. Alliances that had once provided a fragile support system crumbled under pressure, leaving survivors isolated and vulnerable. The psychological toll was immense. Trust had been shattered, and those who had once thrived in the city's underworld now operated in constant fear of reprisal. Even those who escaped immediate danger carried the trauma of witnessing the scale of bloodshed and betrayal that had defined the conflict. The city itself bore silent witness to the consequences. Abandoned buildings, damaged streets, and shuttered businesses were scattered throughout neighborhoods, serving as grim reminders of the violence. Residents, though no longer in immediate danger, remained cautious, and the fear instilled during the war persisted. Parents kept children indoors, commuters took alternate routes, and the social fabric of affected areas shifted. Liverpool had survived, but it was a city forever altered by the war that had erupted in its shadows and spilled into its streets. The legacy of the conflict extended beyond physical destruction. The Albanian Mafia's rise demonstrated that patience, strategic intelligence, and calculated violence could outmatch even long-established local dominance. The city's criminal landscape had been rewritten, with foreign influence now dictating the terms of control. Yet even in victory, the Albanians faced a constant threat of internal betrayal, law enforcement scrutiny, and rival factions plotting revenge. The war may have ended, but its echoes would continue to shape decisions, alliances, and conflicts for years to come. In the end, Liverpool's bloodiest gang war left an indelible mark. The docks, warehouses, and abandoned streets stood as silent witnesses to a period of unprecedented violence. The city had learned, painfully, that power was transient, loyalty fragile, and that the introduction of a new player with ambition and ruthlessness could overturn generations of established order. Liverpool returned to a fragile normalcy, but the memory of the war lingered, a permanent reminder of a time when fear ruled the streets. And survival demanded more than strength. It demanded cunning, strategy, and the ruthless pursuit of power.